Well, I finally found it. I found the card that explains everything that's going on with modern Magic the Gathering and why it's in the state that it's in. Well, I guess I didn't so much as find it as Mark Rosewater kind of inadvertently spilled the beans about it on his Drive to Work podcast, but we have kind of been connecting the dots over the last few episodes about constrained resource strategies versus abundant resource strategies, cards that come into play with all kinds of additional tokens, things that trigger off of those things coming into play, all these sort of parallel play, abundant resource play patterns. And that stuff all stems from one card. And that card is Rock Jockey. Let's talk about Rock Jockey, how he got us into this mess, and what we can learn about it for our own games.
Distraction makers.
Recently in Mark's Drive to Work podcast, he has an episode where he talks about the landfall mechanic. I'm going to summarize it here, so if you want to hear all of it, make sure to go listen to it. There'll be a link in the description. But one of the things that Mark talks about is how way back in 2003, Randy Buehler had promoted Mark to be head designer for Magic the Gathering. And one of his tasks was to come up with a 5-year plan. And Mark, being the overachiever that he is, came up with 7 years worth of ideas. The final idea in the 7th year was the idea of a land matters mechanic or a land matters set. And when it finally became time to enact the land matters theme, Randy Buehler's boss, right? So the guy above Randy promoted Mark, the guy above Randy, Bill Rose, was skeptical. And he told Mark, you've got 3 months to prove to me that we should make a set where land matters. And if at the end of 3 months, I'm not thrilled with the idea, we're going to pivot and we're going to do something else. And so Mark got to work and he came up with somewhere in the neighborhood of like 45 different land mechanics. And one of them was inspired by Rock Jockey. Rock Jockey costs 2 generic mana and 1 red. It is a creature goblin. You can't play Rock Jockey if you played a land this turn. You can't play lands if you played Rock Jockey this turn. And it's a 3/3. So at the time, a 3/3 4/3 in red was above curve. Now, that seems kind of silly. The initial mechanic that Mark had come up with was using this as its base template. The idea was to use your land drop, right? The actual land drop itself, not actually playing the land, but your ability to play the land as a resource. And this makes sense around those times because there was a lot of effort being put in to design mechanics that were using other resources of Magic in new and interesting ways. This stems way back to Necropotence, probably before that, with something like Channel. But basically the ability for you to spend some kind of resource that the game bestows upon you in a different and interesting, unique way. And so this mechanic was a trade-off, right? It had friction. It was a meaningful decision that was saying, all right, well, instead of playing my land drop for the turn, I would like to play this more powerful creature, but that will mess up my curve, right? It'll make it so that I'm 1 land behind my opponent. But there are certain decks that like would want to give up that option in order to play a more powerful card early. Particularly red deck wins might want this kind of mechanic. So they started pursuing this mechanic. They did some testing and found that newer players really did not understand what was going on and why you would want to do this. They just sort of wanted to play their cards, and then they didn't really get how this was beneficial to them. And they were losing games without realizing what the actual problem was, like why they actually lost the game. More advanced players were interested and thought this was a neat idea that they could sort of trade one resource for another. And they understood how to kind of manage it on curve, those sort of things. This response from the casual player sort of gave Mark an idea, which was, how about instead we do exactly the opposite of Goblin Rock Jockey, and we just reward players for playing their lands. And once Mark sort of came up with Landfall and they started testing that idea, he quickly realized that, oh, this is really interesting. I am hoping to draw a land, and normally that's not how I feel. And so you're changing a negative kind of into a positive. There were other designers in R&D that did not think this was a good idea. They sort of were, first of all, skeptical about making a set where lands would matter at all, because lands matter in every set, right? They are the thing that plays the spells that win you the game. And then once Landfall became the mechanic they were pursuing, it sounds like the pushback came from the feeling that being rewarded for doing basically nothing was unfair, right? You were not giving up anything. You were being rewarded for doing something that you were already going to do anyway. As I'm listening to Mark Rosewater discuss this on his Drive to Work podcast, I became more concerned. I started to connect the dots between this idea of being rewarded just for doing something you were already going to do, and the state that Magic is in now. Mark says, games are a way for you to test skills that are important for real life without the threat. You want to make the players have to make decisions, and by learning and improving and making those decisions, they get better. Landfall flew in the face of that. We're just going to reward you for doing something that if we didn't reward you for doing, you would do anyway. It's a free reward. I think that concept on its own, it's not actually the thing that concerned me the most about what he was saying. Part that concerned me the most was when he starts talking about how he sees this as tying into psychology. And he brings up the idea of small incremental rewards being a great motivator for people. The idea of small incremental rewards is one of the most efficient ways to motivate people. That's exactly what we're doing. I was at a point in my design where I was trying to challenge the player, and all of a sudden we made a mechanic that did not challenge the player, almost the opposite. I'm just going to reward you for what you want to do. And it felt really good. And this comes from the Skinner box experiment, that one of the greatest motivators is incremental rewards given in sort of random intervals. And it was compelling mice, I think in this instance, to press a button repeatedly, assuming that at some point a reward would be given. And they sort of started to develop neurotic behavior because these rewards were given in sort of these random intervals. And so they started acting in strange ways, thinking that that was what was getting them the reward. And we see this all over modern game design. It has its roots in like the casino game industry, but mostly we see it in modern game design through loot boxes and battle passes and gameplay design generally. That is this small incremental reward that slowly moves players to associate sort of positive feelings with doing particular actions like playing the game itself. You know, in some ways I can't necessarily fault Mark for going down this path. Like obviously the goal of game design is to bring players joy, experiences that they enjoy, right? Give players a reason to continue to play, and that you're not excluding large portions of the player base that don't necessarily like the idea of battling through constrained resources or making these really tough, difficult strategic decisions. Previously, when the focus was on competitive play, this was how Magic was designed and how it was played. It had a intense focus on strategic decision making. How do I find a line of play that will win me this game with constrained resources and through a game state that didn't go according to my plan? When we start to look at landfall or not just landfall, but mechanics that also do something similar, right? This gets us back to the problems that I'm sort of having with modern Magic design. And it's that players are being rewarded for doing things that they would be doing anyway, right? You're playing a creature, you're getting a reward. You're playing a land, you're getting a reward. You're drawing a card, you're getting a reward. It narrows the game down to a single sub-game where if your opponent does not have an answer for the thing that you're presenting, the game is effectively over because a single card is an army, right? It's not one card anymore. There's just been so many mechanics that fall under this category. I mean, you can look at prowess as one of them. Prepared, the new one from Secrets of Strixhaven, feels like this, where it's a creature that just comes with a spell. I wanted to check my biases, right? Because I have a feeling that this is the direction that Magic has gone in by watching Pro Tour coverage or, whatever. So I wanted to try to capture at least some portion of these parallel play, abundant resource, gimme mechanics in a data set and compare over time how many more cards have this kind of effect versus what was going on before. What percentage of cards in the standard metagame have an enters effect? And then we can compare that to Pioneer, we can compare that to Modern, and we compare that to all time to sort of see over time what percentage of the cards in the pool, in the card pool, have an enters effect. Now, just because something has an enters effect, it does not mean it's inherently a positive effect. So first, let's look at the number of cards that just have enters effects, and then we'll look at what segments of those enters effects and whether or not they're like positive or negative. Okay, before we get into the data, I want to caveat this first with this data set is not perfect. We are just doing a keyword search, which means it's going to grab a bunch of stuff that just happens to have these like words on the card somewhere. They might not necessarily be related directly to each other, but we are using the same criteria for each of the data sets. That also probably means that we are missing abilities that generate a lot of value just because we're focused squarely on things that care when something comes into play. Where something like prowess, I guess, right, would just care when you cast a spell. It doesn't trigger off of the same sort of enters criteria. Let's take a look at the standard card pool. And we have 34% of cards in the standard card pool mention enters and 66% that don't. And then when we zoom in on the enters cards, we have 9.1% of them that mention whenever enters. And then we have 6.4% that mention enters create. We have 6% that say enters tap. And enters tapped is obviously more than likely a drawback. But again, we're capturing kind of, everything. And we're looking at like, all right, what's the percentage of these that do something kind of like landfall? Then we have 4.7% that say enters draw. We have 4.7% that says enters and then mentions a +1/+1 counter somewhere. We have 3.7% that say it enters sacrifice. And we have 3.5% that say enters exile. This also highlights one of the biggest problems with landfall is that it creates a feedback loop, right? Because it's whenever a land enters, it's not when the next land enters. It's not capped at a single land. It's just every time you get a land into play, you get some kind of a benefit, which means that it's a resource generating positive feedback loop where the card, whatever advantage you're getting from the landfall, can get you to more lands, which can get you to more landfall, which can get you to more lands, because the lands are the things that play the spells that have the landfall effects. And this is kind of similar, like honestly, in the previous video, we're talking about Necropotence and how Necropotence has an effect that's kind of like this, where you can use Necropotence to accumulate card advantage that can stop your opponent from being able to deal any kind of damage to you, which gives you more life points to use Necropotence to draw more cards. But yeah, I do wonder if landfall wouldn't be quite so problematic if it was just like limited, right? Like one land per turn or whatever it is, just some kind of limiter, right? It's just unconstrained resource accumulation, I think, is just as bad as unconstrained resource constraint. At least Necropotence says spend one life to draw a card, right? Landfall, I guess you're limited by however creative you can be with getting as many lands into play as possible, and then being able to use those lands to then accumulate more value. So things start to get particularly interesting when we start to compare formats against each other. So if we look at the Pioneer card pool, 26.3% of the cards in the card pool have an enters effect, and 73.7% do not. When we're comparing that to Standard, we can see a pretty substantial increase in the number of cards in Standard's card pool that mention the term enters. This does not inherently mean that this is all positive enters effects, but we can kind of assume, given the play patterns that we see, that might be the case. And then we can see kind of a similar breakdown in the percentages of enters effects. So whenever enters is 6.4%, which is a substantial decrease from Standard's 9.1% of the card pool saying whenever enters. Also keep in mind that the cards that are in Standard are also part of Pioneer's card pool. So we are expanding the card pool, but that card pool includes the cards that are in Standard. Okay, next let's take a look at Modern. And Modern, again, we see a reduction in the number of cards, the percentage of the cards in the card pool that mention the keyword, that have enters. So 22.8% of cards in Modern have enters effects, where 77.2% don't, which is a reduction again from the Pioneer card pool, and a very substantial reduction from Standard's 34%. And again, we can see another reduction in the whenever enters and down the line with the different enters effects. Finally, let's take a look at all of the cards from Magic. This is the entirety of Magic's card pool over the course of all of its history. And we can see that 20.8% of cards across Magic's entire history have an enters effect. And this would be creatures, enchantments, artifacts, whatever it is, that basically we are correlating the idea of the term enters with positive value associations, but we don't necessarily know if that's actually being captured. It could also be things like enters tapped or enters sacrifice. When we look at enters comparatively across the history of Magic, and with the sort of positive abundant resource parallel play trends that we're seeing with Magic, we can see that the Standard card pool percentage at 34% is substantially higher than when we look at Magic's card pool in its totality. We talked about Mark's design reasoning for landfall and landfall-like abilities, this sort of abundant resource parallel play style, and the reason why we're seeing all these incremental rewards being put on cards, and what that means for the game long term, and your ability to sort of build up tons of resources and paper over maybe some small mistakes that you made and that you're sort of recovering by having a card that has multiple other cards stapled to it. What's the drawback, right? Like why is this a problem? And what can we learn from this type of design for our own games? Something that Mark brings up is this idea of confusing interesting with fun. And I agree. It's very easy to confuse interesting with fun. The question just is, what is fun, right? And that's, I think, the question we have to define for ourselves in the experience that we are creating. What is considered fun? Is it fun to find a path to victory through constrained resources? Is it fun to have abundant resources and make a huge board state and that's really complicated and hard for you to understand or anyone around you and attack? Yeah, I mean, some players do find that fun. I tend to use the word compelling because I think that's a broader perspective on the matter, where you can create experiences that are more than just fun. But I think something that is compelling, when we look at our chart that borders between frustration and boredom, landfall type mechanics, I think, fall pretty squarely in the novelty section of this graph, in that it is the incremental rewards to keep players from that boredom, right? We're getting an extra little thing when we do something. Therefore, ooh, that's neat. I like that. But we're not moving into that frustration category, that challenge category that makes players feel like they're improving or giving them a reason to dig deeper into Magic systems and master the game. And the players that are doing that are being met with a game that is disincentivizing that kind of play. It's not giving them the tools to play a play pattern other than one that is abundant and parallel. And I think that's where Magic, for me, has started to feel one-dimensional. These cards that are so powerful and accumulate these resources are so overwhelmingly strong that why would I bother to play the constrained resource side of this? Why not lean completely into the abundance and make it another player's problem to stop me? That seems to be the conclusion with most of Magic's, especially the commander formats. But it feels like that's the consensus among most of Magic's competitive formats at this point. We have a lot of talk about why you should play interaction in Commander, because it's eating your vegetables or whatever, or that, somehow it kind of like wins you the game. But like, when the threats are this strong and the removal is not strong enough, why not just accumulate more resources and overwhelm your opponents? Whatever interaction your opponents are playing, it sort of becomes a liability, right? Because you are either keeping your mana available to play that removal, right? I mean, in the case of like Swords to Plowshares or whatever, that's probably fine because it's just a single white mana. You must keep those resources available rather than spending them on investing in more resources where your opponents could be doing that and they'll just overwhelm whatever removal it is that you have. And so we end up with this game state that is overwhelmingly crufty, difficult to manage, difficult to parse, because it feels good to get rewarded for doing something that you were already going to do. And I think the question that I'm left asking at the end here is, if games are supposed to teach players life lessons, right? If they can, at least, right? That's one of the things games can do. If it's giving players the opportunity to test something out, to test a hypothesis, to train themselves and experiment and learn without the threat of it being real, right? And you can learn a lot of these lessons and then take them into real life. What is the lesson that Landfall is teaching players? And I shouldn't just say Landfall specifically. I should say, what is the lesson that abundant resource gameplay is teaching players? It's teaching them that they can have a small reward for doing something that they were already going to do anyway. It's hard to convince people to play a game that feels bad, right? Like, I get it. I get how tough that is. I get how tough it is to convince players that learning how to play a game that has constrained resource play patterns, moving through that difficulty to get to the reward that's on the other side is tough, right? There's very few games I think that have been able to accomplish that, but Magic was one of them, right? And maybe all of this is, maybe that had stopped working, right? And that type of gameplay had begun, like the players that were interested in it had began to age out of it or whatever happened, and the player base began to dwindle. And then this was the solution that they found, that you can attract a wide array of casual players by giving them small incremental rewards for doing game actions that they were going to do anyway. For me personally, I think that that's a substantially less interesting game. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you want to continue the conversation, you can join the Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.